Okay, good morning, Dad. Today is Wednesday, October 23rd, and let's talk a little bit about BRICS. So this BRICS summit meeting is taking off in Kazan. I want to start with sort of a different question though. Is America afraid of BRICS? And should we be afraid of BRICS? Is it a big deal?
Well, the answer to the second question is easy. Yes. No. I mean, no, we should not be afraid of BRICS. BRICS, I guess when you say we, you're talking about the U.S.,
Yeah, I
the
should say
West.
that, right?
No, we should not, obviously. We should actually join it. But of course, to join it, we have to cease to be the hegemon. We have to drop all our sanctions because BRICS is about sovereignty. It's about multipolarity, and we don't like that. But we should. There's just no reason. It's actually, again, as we've said many times, being a hegemon is actually not to our own benefit. It's just something. It's a role that we should give up, and then we could prosper alongside other countries. But we don't want to do it. So yeah, we should join BRICS, but we won't. Now, is America afraid of BRICS? I think it's at least worried about BRICS. I mean, BRICS is now, it's not clear what BRICS is going to become, how successful it's going to be. I mean, there are a lot of reasons to be hopeful, but BRICS has its weaknesses. I mean, I think you have to admit that its decisions, according to my understanding, are made by consensus, and it has already expanded significantly. Right, it's now BRICS plus. And that creates problems. It makes it a kind of a very unwieldy organization. And I think probably even more importantly, as it actually grows and as it becomes increasingly a real alternative to the U.S.-led system, the U.S. is going to work to bring it down. I think there's just no question about it. It's probably nervous. I'm sure the U.S. is nervous about it. The U.S. elite is nervous about BRICS right now. But when it sees it as a real threat, it'll go after it. I mean, look, that's what the U.S. does, and they have ways of bringing it down. Especially if BRICS grows rapidly and brings in a lot of members. Well, a lot of those members have very close ties to the U.S., and the U.S. could end up using one of them. I think an example could have been Argentina. Now, Argentina was poised to join BRICS, and then Milei was elected. It happened before Argentina actually joined it, so they didn't join it. But you can imagine if Argentina had already joined it, and Milei was in there, and if they have a consensus-based, decision-making system, he could have gummed up the works quite easily. And I think the U.S., through all kinds of methods, through pressuring countries, rigging elections, whatever, it could make BRICS work very difficult.
So when you say it has to be a consensus, it has to be all the BRICS members have to agree. You don't have a majority. So
Yeah, well,
one
it's
country.
it's actually my understanding is consensus. Maybe that's not completely true, but it doesn't seem to have much of a structure. So when it comes down to it, yeah, it's just sort of like everybody gets together and everybody agrees on it. Now, maybe there's something, but I'm not aware of any bylaws or anything of the sort.
Right.
So,
I imagine structure might be added later on. It's still such kind of a new thing. We don't really fully
right.
understand it. And when you talk about, that BRICS is offering an alternative, basically a new system, what does that new system really mean? And the U.S. will try to bring that system down. Are we talking purely a financial system, a new financial infrastructure? Is that really what we talk about when we're talking about BRICS? I mean, it's not a military bloc. It's just kind of these... It's almost like
Yeah, it's
a
not
group
military.
of like-minded just
Yeah.
like-minded countries.
Yeah, well, not
It's kind
necessarily
of
even
what it's-
like-minded. I mean, that's kind of the point, is that, okay, we're just about multipolarity.
Or,
You know,
well,
you can be,
like-minded in the sense that you can be more multipolar, that
okay,
like-minded that you don't tell us what to do, not that we
right,
all,
right. You know, it believes in
subscribe to
sovereignty.
some form
You know,
of
that's
government.
right. So anyway, it is an answer to U.S.-led hegemony. You know, that's what it is. So the U.S.-led hegemony is in great part enforced by the U.S. dominance of the world's financial system. The U.S. The U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency. The SWIFT system is the means by which banks all around the world transfer funds, from one country to another. And that's dominated by the U.S. That's and then other things too, like insurance. That's actually dominated by London, is my understanding. So you have so much of world trade and is really under the hegemony of the West. And it goes back actually during World War II. I think it was it was when the Bretton Woods meeting was established, and they worked out a sort of a new architecture for the world that was going to follow World War II. So I believe at that time it was like the IMF and the World Bank. Those are other institutions which are under the control of the West and are used to dominate a lot of countries. A country gets severely in debt, the IMF can dictate policies to it. We
Right.
saw how that occurred. I think it was the World Bank, actually gave very large loans to Ukraine, and actually they violated their own rules in doing so. Clearly, Ukraine didn't qualify to receive those loans, but it's a Western-controlled institution, and so it became an instrument of Western policy.
Right, but these Western institutions aren't really necessarily fully under Western control anymore. I mean, I believe the IMF, you correct me if I'm wrong, spoke actually highly of BRICS, said that this is a good thing, a good development, which obviously the U.S. doesn't want the IMF to say, but we don't have control. The United Nations, the Secretary General of the UN is also, the United Nations is a Western institution. It was established for
Right.
the Western rules-based order. But now the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, is in Kazan and meeting Putin. But Putin also has an arrest warrant out from him by the other Western institution,
right.
the ICC, the International Criminal Court. So there's clearly these Western-led institutions are no longer fully under our control. I think the way that we used to think that they were, and so
I think that's
there's
probably
division.
true.
It's breaking apart.
Right.
So
well, to give the United Nations obviously is not completely under Western control. But many of the agencies are, and so Western influence in the UN is way out of proportion of the population that Western countries can claim as their own. But it's not fully under Western control. Gutierrez does things occasionally that that the West doesn't like. That's not new. And past secretary generals have too. Now the IMF, that was interesting, that statement that they made, and it just may be they're being realistic and diplomatic. They may be worried about the rise of BRICS, but they're starting to realize that this is something that we might have to work with. So let's try to be friendly.
Right. And so you said that the U.S. it's some sort of method of attack is to it has this modus operandi of attack. Like if this thing is new system is threatening us.
That's right. I think the fact that they haven't gone into full attack mode tells you that they're not really scared yet. But at some point they will. I think it's just inevitable. That's the way the hegemon works. If this really becomes a threat to hegemony, they will go after it.
Right, but how do they even go after it? That's like the attacks that we have. If we're talking about attacking a new financial system or structure, just strengthens the need and the cause for an alternative system. Trade is being done between Russia and China. These are two big countries, and it's all denominated in RMB and in rubles now. They're outside of the system. We're seeing that and happening more and more around the globe. So if the U.S. goes on an attack, they really would be attacking themselves, right? I mean, how would they attack, gum up the works? You mentioned one thing, that maybe put in actors within BRICS to foment gum up the works, some type of little BRICS revolution, get some people in there, and then so they can't have consensus. But then they'll probably just be kicked out of BRICS, right? I mean,
yeah. Well, yeah. Well, BRICS is going to have to, BRICS is going to have to be ready for that, and maybe they are. I would be very surprised if they haven't talked about those possibilities among themselves. Now, you just mentioned Russia and China trade. This is booming trade. It's grown by leaps and bounds over the last few years, especially since the SMO and the economic sanctions against Russia. But that is, that's not because of BRICS. That's bilateral, and that's true of a lot of these other moves away from the dollar that we're seeing. Now, BRICS hasn't gotten to the point where it has its own alternative to the dollar. Apparently, there was some talk about a BRICS currency, and recently Putin himself threw cold water on that. He says we just don't have any plans for that now. We're not even talking about it. But what they are talking about, and I think are in the initial stages of developing, is an alternative to the SWIFT system. I think first they're working on working out a system of exchange between central banks, and that would be useful for certain kinds of trade. Like when we're talking about huge amounts of commodities, often those transactions can go through central banks. Oil and grain and that kind of thing. But yeah, at this point, it's again, there is also a BRICS bank that's kind of the BRICS alternative to the World Bank. That already has been established, and I don't know how many loans it has extended so far, but it's there, and it exists, it operates. Yeah, right now it's we're just looking at something in the very early stages, and I guess what I say is that it's just a general worry. I'm very I think BRICS is a very good phenomenon, and I wish it success. I just worry that that because I've seen both the Chinese and Russians actually be rather naive in the past. The Russians especially, like with the Minsk Accords and and various other agreements. I could think of BRICS as possibly being somewhat analogous to that. It's rather idealistic. It kind of assumes a certain amount of goodwill on the other side. That they're going to. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they really have learned their lessons, and they're going to be they're prepared for pressure and efforts at subversion. I think that's certainly possible. But if they've made those preparations, I'm not aware of them, and I kind of worry about the expansion without a real solid system in place.
Yeah, I mean, you say Russia and China were naive in the past, but I mean, Putin's definitely not naive anymore, and neither is Xi Jinping.
Let's hope so.
After, so
let's hope so.
And I'm just wondering, like, how could the United States even go about trying to stop the formation of an alternative to SWIFT, for example, if that's the real threat to the U.S. dollar? Because sanctions don't work. Military intervention doesn't work. People are also catching wise on color revolutions. That the CIA is operating in the National Endowment for Democracy is funneling money to these rebellious groups around the world. The people are catching on. So I just don't think that the U.S. has the tools in its tool belt anymore once people kind of know how the game is working around the world. So if they do try to stop it, I think it might end up just damaging us, the West, more, and strengthening BRICS. Just saying, yeah, this is exactly why we need BRICS, is because the U.S. will try to sanction you and scream at you and threaten violence if you step out of line. And that's the whole point of this thing, that you don't have to worry about that anymore, right?
Right. Yeah, well, we'll see. You make very good points. I think there still is. I think there will be efforts to subvert it if there haven't been already. And again, through those countries that do have close ties to the U.S., that could, experience elections that bring them closer back into the U.S. orbit. And it kind of, it depends on, again, BRICS can work out some system to deal with those kind of situations, and maybe they have. Maybe they've thought this through. I just hope so.
Is BRICS, what else is BRICS? I mean, other than developing an alternative financial infrastructure for the world?
Well, they also, I believe that they are setting up a grain exchange. I don't know exactly how these work, and then, they're planning other exchanges as well. So that it would, again, it would be a platform where certain commodities could be traded. And that, again, facilitates trade among BRICS members.
Do you think there's any chance that the U.S. or Western countries will want to join BRICS and be part of this? Like, is Trump a wild enough card where that it's possible that he'd be like, yeah, let's be part of BRICS, And
well, it was
and the
Trump,
sanctions, because he says he's not a fan of sanctions.
Yeah, well, he says all kinds of things. I think it was just recently he said that he would deal with a move away from the dollar by slapping 100% tariffs on any country that stopped using the dollar. So, no, I don't think he's anywhere close to having the mindset to join BRICS.
Well, that's the
maybe some days he might think that, but other days he won't. That's
right,
Trump.
But that's just proof in itself that that type of response. That's exactly why countries need BRICS. They want BRICS. It's just like, no, you have to use
no, I think
our
he would.
system.
Right, he would probably accelerate the movement from the dollar if he tried to do that.
Right, but that's the thing, is the only thing that we have in our toolbook right now is just the stick, and it's just not working anymore. We were not able to entice people. We just threaten them, and it backfires.
Yeah,
So
that's what we're discovering. I mean, that's right. And I think, again, the war in Ukraine, the launch of the SMO, and the sanctions that followed, those were the watershed moment that showed it. We went in with such confidence. We were going to destroy Russia. Watch the world. Watch everybody, all of you out there, the rest of the world, watch us. We're going to destroy Russia. And now, Russia is obviously doing quite well. One of the I think the most interesting things about this BRICS summit is the coverage of it. I've seen many different reports in the West, and they all acknowledge that this proves that Russia is not isolated. They just admit it,
right.
And which is what we've been saying, for a long time, and other people have been saying for a long time. But the West wasn't. I think just like a month ago, Tony Blinken was claiming that Russia was completely isolated. And, that was just sort of like, that was the, that was the talking point in the West. It's just amazing. The media, again, Western media are basically just propaganda organs. So they had that talking point for a long time, just like, we've talked about sharpest attack, and, they're completely isolated. They're pariahs, and right up until BRICS, and then you see all these world leaders flying into Russia and eager to seek out Putin, and to get to shake his hand and to be have their picture taken with him and everything, and it was just so obvious. I mean, you couldn't hide the reality any longer. So, they eventually, just like in the case of Joe Biden and his dementia, reality just breaks in. They kind of try to hold the dam as long as they can, but eventually the dam bursts. And I think that's what happens. So you just see a lot of these people, that are reporting it seem visibly upset and angry about it, but they had to admit that, boy, Russia is not isolated.
Yeah. Right. No, I was surprised too. I read some of those headlines as well, and some of those articles. Articles like from CNN even just admitting that this is proof that Russia is not isolated. All these world leaders, and not just like small third world country world leaders. We're talking about big players. India, Brazil. I guess Lula was injured, but video called in. But India and China, just all these huge countries. Iran, of course, Pezeshkian's over there. So it's just proof that it doesn't work, and the BRICS is the new hot commodity in town, the new hot club that's open, and we're out there just looking through the window, just bitter and upset,
Yeah.
and are wanting. And nobody wants to join our club anymore, and why would they? Our club has been a failure, and it's ruled through fear. So
Right. Well, you look, I mean, the contrast, between BRICS members and their relationship to BRICS and, let's say, the Europeans and their relationship to NATO and to the, well, Western hegemony is really stark. I mean, again, BRICS is all about sovereignty. Okay, you have your policies, we have our policies, you have your civilization, we have our civilization, and we just get along, we trade, and we don't interfere in each other's affairs. Europe could have gone along with that too. But they have submitted themselves entirely to U.S.-led hegemony, and they've really lost their own voice in the world. Nobody takes the Europeans seriously anymore because everybody knows that they're vassals of the U.S., right? They don't have an independent foreign policy. The U.S. even blows up their pipelines, and they just say yes, massa. It's just right.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
really
no, it's
quite extraordinary. I mean, I think Europe has just made a fatal mistake by going down that road.
Do you think that Europe is going to course correct
Well, there
after
is
them?
a
That's what we're seeing
possibility.
a sign.
Right. Well, of course, I know that I believe Viktor Orban and also the Serbian president have expressed an interest in joining BRICS. But, they've always, well, first of all, Serbia is not part of the EU yet. But of course, Hungary is. So there are some European countries that but they're already considered outliers and dissidents, within Europe. Yeah, you would have to see a real kind of a revolution, a real revolution, throwing off the yoke of the U.S. within Europe. And, we've talked about the rumblings of that, but I think we're still quite a ways. The European governments are, with the exception, again, of Hungary and Slovakia, Serbia, they're very solidly, under the yoke of the U.S. But it could change. We are seeing some, again, rumblings. But
Right.
sometimes these things can catch you by surprise. I think, what is it? I forget who it was who said that things, might not change for 100 years, and then in a day, you get 100 years worth of change. I know I didn't quote that correctly,
Yeah,
but more or less that's the idea. And that's really the way history often works. So we just kind of get the sense like, man, it's never going to change. And then one day it does, it blows up. And we might see that in Europe. I hope so, for the sake of Europe. I hope so, and that it comes sooner. I think it has to come eventually, but I hope that it comes in a matter of a few years rather than decades.
Well, if that happens, then I mean, we're going to see a huge change here in the U.S. as well, right? I mean, basically, we're alone at that point.
Right. Yeah. Well, we see that like occasionally with votes on Israel and Palestine, where it's basically like the U.S. and not even, maybe Britain will abstain. Even Britain said can't quite go along with it. It'll be the U.S., Israel, and Fiji, or something like that, and that's happened.
Right.
Maybe there are a couple other Pacific Island nations or something, but that's it. And it shows our isolation on that particular issue. But yeah, it'll eventually be that on everything if Europe actually breaks free.
Mm-hmm. You said earlier that the media was always carrying on this narrative that Russia was isolated, Russia's alone in the world now, and then all of a sudden the dam broke. Do you think you said that was basically they're coming face to reality, or do you think that there's like a memo that's given out to media saying that, well, first of all, you have to adopt that isolation strategy. Now it's okay to report something because it's getting too real. I mean, how does it work? I feel like is that how our media works now? That all of our media are given a memo from the White House or these certain agencies? Because we've seen this, you mentioned Joe Biden and him being sharp as attack, these talking points. JD Vance is weird. Same thing with, with COVID, the idea of a lab leak theory or anything like this. It's just, these were the points, and everybody was in lockstep.
Right.
How much of that is true that's just how Western media is now?
Well, obviously it is to a great extent, and you gave wonderful examples of that. But I think it would be an exaggeration, like I was saying, that there are organs of propaganda. It's often true, but it's not always true. There still is a little bit of independence. They still do have to worry somewhat about their own credibility. And I think maybe that's like, I don't think they got a memo from the White House saying that you can now say that our president is a dementia patient. It was just that, he was out there on the stage and they just couldn't hide it anymore. It was reality breaking through.
What about in the UK media? I heard Alexander McCurris
Right.
sort of make that claim.
Yeah,
So-
no. He had actually some very, very interesting observations. I agree. He's talking about this BRICS summit. It's just that it's, first of all, they just try to pretend that it doesn't exist. And I think they're like pretty much doing that. It's just like to the extent that they mention it, they never even use the word BRICS and they don't call it a summit. So it's like a meeting being held in Russia. I saw a little bit of that actually in a CBS News report. He just kind of started off, this is something the Russians call a BRIC meeting or BRICS meeting. But eventually it kind of moved away from that. So, I think he was just reflecting this British tendency. That suggests that they really, because that is so bizarre and so extreme that the British media actually did receive orders not to talk about it. I think he's right. I don't know how else to explain what's going on there. The U.S., we've talked about the decline of free speech in this country. It's under attack, but it still exists. It still is something valued by a large portion of the population, and it still has a certain amount of protection. It receives protection in the courts. The British really don't have that, and so the government is really unconstrained when it comes to controlling the narrative, and I think this is one case.
How do you claim to be a democracy if you control the media? That sounds very Soviet to me. The idea that everything's basically state owned in the sense, or the state is putting its fingers on it. So yeah, state controlled, right? Maybe not owned, but yeah, it's obviously they're controlling it to a very large extent. So is it fair to say that the UK really isn't a democracy, or even the US to some extent really isn't that much of a democracy? Or do we know? Do we take the media out of that?
Well, I guess you have to say that they're democracies, at least technically, right? They have the apparatus of a democracy. They have the procedures of a democracy. They have elections. But yeah, do the people rule? That's what democracy means. And I think the short answer is no. It's just clear that that the elite gets its way. It's just I think that like Trump's first term made that crystal clear. He was elected, with the idea of like Zelensky in Ukraine of making peace with Russia, but it was just like the people in charge. Oh no, you're not going to do that. And so we got the Russia hoax, and he said, eventually at the end, I'm not going to do that. And he was arming Ukraine to its teeth, right? And I think it's true with all kinds of issues. I think it's really beyond the scope of this program to get into all of them. But in general, I won't say elections don't make a difference. They do, but they don't make a whole lot of difference. And it just, in the end, it's like the elite, they have their preferences, they have their sacred policies, and those policies remain regardless of who the people vote for. I think it's, equally true in Great Britain, or probably more true, rather.
Are there some, just when I look around the world, I don't really see democracies as really the best form of government. And we always grew up just how great democracies are, and democracies are the best thing in the world. And then, I lived for 10 years in Shanghai, and I really loved it there. I thought it was the country was run very well. I've traveled around. So, and then I'm just seeing, I'm just wondering, do democracies, are they broken now? Are they, is there an example where democracies are a great example form of governance? Like, what is the best form of governance in this age? I just feel like we have this illusion of choice. And that's what the democracy does. Is all the Western countries give you this illusion that, oh yeah, you guys are in charge. But at the end of the day, you always get the same thing. It's like choosing between
Mm.
Pepsi and Coke. And we all get really angry about which one we like. But at the end of the day, it's always the same. And things always seem to be slow. Democracies always seem to overpromise, overspend. They have very short-term thinking. Whereas when you have a system like, where in Singapore, where you had one guy that just said, all right, I'm going to take charge for 50 years and rock this. And he does. And just like how you have with somebody that's running a company, you don't want to have to change the new company leadership every couple of years. And all of a sudden everything's in chaos and they try to undo what the last guy did. And so it just seems like the systems we have now don't allow for long-term thinking, and it just causes all these problems with debt because we are able to overspend, and we have the printing press so we can do it.
Right.
Whereas these other countries that people are always afraid, like, oh, China, it's just they are autocratic and they'll just throw you in jail if you look at them wrong. It's not true. Like, China obviously wants the best for its people, and it's setting long-term goals and plans for it. And like, I never really felt the pressure, or Chinese friends that all of a sudden, like, yo, you can't speak about this or that. It was pretty open. You could
Hmm.
talk smack about the government. It wasn't a big deal. It's not like, but actually here, in a way, I almost feel like I'm censored more because there's all these things that are politically incorrect, or that you don't know what one person stands on. If this person loves Trump or this person thinks he's Hitler, you just can't really
Yeah,
get
you
into
have to watch your
politics.
speech
But I
very
did,
carefully. Yeah, no,
right, but
I
I
had the
never
same
had that in
experience,
China.
and right, you could have very freewheeling discussions, and people could be highly critical of the government. I remember that.
Mm,
But well, it does need to be pointed out that there are some ways in which China is authoritarian and less tolerant of freedom than the U.S. is. And one is like, yeah, you can speak your mind in China. There's no question about that. And I think you're right. Actually, probably the Chinese are more outspoken and among themselves than Americans are, and probably many Westerners are at this point. But for example, it is much more difficult to, let's say, organize a demonstration against the government, or go on a march or whatever. Now, the thing is, we are seeing an erosion of that even within the West. Particularly in places like Germany and the UK, where there have been really vicious crackdowns. Somebody waved a Palestinian flag, and and the guy ends up in jail, or people, for expressing certain sentiments. I mean, or attempting to run some kind of platform, they get the knock on the door and they end up in jail. This happens in both the UK and Germany, and I'm sure in other European countries. So they're losing. They're certainly not stellar examples of the right to assembly or the right to protest or anything. But it's true. You really, the Chinese the government's very strict about that, and you can't create alternative organizations, or those are very highly restricted. That's a big difference, I think. But I really don't know. Just looking down the road, I'm not all that confident that we will continue to have those rights in this country. We still do, but I think that over time, those rights are going to erode, just like the free speech rights are eroding now. But that's one thing. I guess I would say, just in general, about democracy versus other forms of government, is that every form of government can be corrupted. I think the important truth is that in fact every country does have a ruling elite. I mean, it's just the way societies form over time, and you can't really escape that fact. So in a way, you could say democracy is an illusion. The idea that the masses rule. At the best you can have, no matter what form of government you want to have people at the top who actually have the best interests of the country at heart. And I think that, more or less we had that, decades ago in the West, that, people felt that's one reason, people were desperate to get to the West, from places like the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact and communist China. Those were truly oppressive countries. We did have freedom, but, they were prosperous, well-run, orderly countries. But over time, our system of government, which did quite well back then, has been corrupted, and their systems of government, well, there's no longer a Soviet Union, but the Communist Party is still in charge, but it has undergone real reforms. It really has learned lessons from its mistakes, and it's really been very, very successful over the last few decades. So it's really, I think it comes down to, systems of government matter, but probably what matters most is the people that you have at the top. What kind of people, what kind of ethos they have. And at this time, the people that run the Western countries are really not devoted to the welfare of their own people. They're globalists that are part of this hegemonic program, and they're committed to maintaining that hegemony. And it's to our detriment. That is to the peoples of the West, the various peoples of the West, but also, a real threat to global peace.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, it's true. China, I understand China still isn't perfect by any means. I lived through the 2022 COVID lockdowns in Shanghai, and I got to see how authoritarian China could be. But by and large, though, it seems like they do have the leaders, like you're saying, have the best interests of their country at heart. They make mistakes, and the system's not perfect, but it just, like you said, it doesn't seem like Western democracies, their purpose at heart is to preserve Western hegemony. It's not about the bettering the people, the lives of the people living there anymore. And I don't know, how do we get out of that? Can we get into a new system? Do you think that the whole thing kind of has to fall down, or is really the problem maybe is the fact that we have our money's broken and that allowed it? Like, if you kind of track when the United States started to veer off course a bit more, is maybe after we got off the gold standard in 71, and then we began to finance all these wars just with our own money, and it allowed for the creation of this deep state to be just constantly going. But if we had real sound money, then it wouldn't allow for this continuous spending, and it would kind of keep the government in check, and then we could be a bit more realistic. Because I feel like the problem with democracies now is that just everybody just gets elected by spending more and more money, promising to give more and more money, and we have the printing press to do it. If it was supposed to be like, okay, you guys, I promise you this, then that means everybody's got to pay X amount more in taxes. Then, things would balance out, and we'd realize, oh, there's a trade-off, but we don't have that mechanism.
Yeah.
So maybe democracies can't work without sound money. I don't.
Well, there's something to that. Obviously, sound money would put a brake on a lot of the adventures of the global elite. A perfect example is the Iraq War. I remember, it was easy to whip up this war frenzy, within the country and say, everybody said, let's go get Saddam Hussein, right? And the government could do it because they didn't actually have to send the people a bill, And it was not too long into the war, or shortly after the end of the war, that somebody figured, the economists did calculations and found out that, it would, to pay for what, the war has cost so far, it ended up costing a lot more. Like every American family would have to pay $40,000. And if with sound money, you would be, and a conservative fiscal system where you can't just print money at will, you would have to raise taxes, right, to cover that. And people were saying, "You crazy? I'm not going to give you an extra $40,000. What is?" And they said, "Well, you wanted this war." I said, "Forget it. I don't want that war." That's what would happen. Obviously, it would put brakes on it. So that's an important point. But it's, of course, it's more than that. I think you look at, you can point to the going off the gold standard as an important step along this process of empire building. But don't forget that Eisenhower in his farewell speech, introduced the whole notion of the military-industrial complex. And he made it as a warning. He said, these people, they have too much power. We've created a monster. And that monster was created by World War II. It should have been dismantled after World War II. Just like, at the end of World War I, we basically went back to peacetime living, became a republic again. But after World War II, there were the people in charge wanted to keep, this apparatus that had been built up. And so I think that's actually that's another watershed moment. And then, of course, is the fall of the Soviet Union and the unipolar moment that resulted. And that also, we're looking at the consequences of all of those developments now.
So with the rise of the military-industrial complex after World War II, with the collapse of sound money in 1971, getting out the gold standard, and then with the fall of the Soviet Union, do you think these three things have kind of prevented the ability for democracy to work because we've had just sort of too much power now that it's consolidated, that our democracy is essentially defunct, and they can't operate with these, with these events, without sound money, with the military-industrial complex being as big as it is, and with the idea of Western hegemony after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Uh-huh. I think in the U.S., especially, the problems are just too huge to solve. I would, just looking at for example, the debt. That was something that, back in the 90s, some real efforts were made to solve it under Bill Clinton, as a matter of fact. And, we actually had a surplus in at least 1 year, maybe a couple of years. I mean, there was a real attempt to try to bring the problem under control, just talking about the debt there. Of course, at the same time, he was expanding the empire in Europe. But now it's so huge that, you just look at it and say, well, we're screwed. This is, there's nothing people don't even talk about it, just kind of hoping it doesn't collapse on my watch. I think that's the attitude that most people have. The ones that even think about it, the others don't even think about it. They just, but so I'm very pessimistic about the U.S. I just don't see a solution through the current system. In Europe, I'm a little bit more hopeful. I mean, first of all, you do have some European leaders that really have broken away from the consensus. And, we've talked about Serbia and Hungary and Slovakia. But even within the Western countries, okay, even though the globalists are still in charge, there's rising opposition. That we've seen it in Austria. We see it happening in Germany and in France. And I'm sure in other countries as well. And it just seems to me that, the opposition that you find an intelligent opposition that really understands the problems in certain European countries. So I have some hope that maybe even through the present system, that, that some of these opposition parties can come to power and make a difference. Now, clearly, the establishment has shown that they're just not at all reluctant to employ all kinds of dirty tricks to keep them down, and maybe they just will. But I could see at least a possibility. In the U.S., unfortunately, with exception of a few exceptional individuals, such as Thomas Massey, I just don't see that kind of, I don't see a party. That's maybe part of the problem, is that we have this two-party system, and a multi-party system maybe makes it easier for an opposition, a real opposition, to rise. You start off small and you can grow.
Are we defining the opposition as a party that is rejecting Western hegemony? Is that what
I would say that.
Saying?
Right. Yeah.
So right. So we're seeing those movements beginning to take root in Europe, but they can't take root really in the United States, because we're saying against ourselves in a way, right? Because we have that idea.
Right,
but that's how people think about it, against
but
the U.S.
But there are ways,
one.
You can, like Thomas Massey and other libertarians, can draw on U.S. traditions. It was, our founding fathers warned us against this, and other, greats in American history have warned against, the temptation to empire. And so I think that, it was Pat Buchanan that says, it's time to become, back in the 90s, he was fighting, say, okay, now it's time to cease to be an empire and to become a republic again. I mean, you can make calls that are very solidly based in the American tradition to have a more humble foreign policy. And we used to even hear that. Even under George W. Bush, Ken Hugh, he ended up doing the exact opposite, but he talked about having a more, humbler foreign policy. So it's not like, I think you could still have it. It's not like you can make very powerful arguments, that against U.S.-led hegemony within the U.S. and say, hey, this is bad for us. This is corrupting us. Let's focus on our own problems. You kind of see the beginnings of that already, with the hurricanes. A lot of people are saying, why are you talking about Israel? Why are you talking about Ukraine? Let's help the people in Appalachia and in Florida. So there, at least you hear some noise from the bottom, but we just don't have a party that's committed to this in any sort of consistent and coherent way.
Right. So you think that's kind of the only way out for the U.S. is if we can kind of fan that little kernel of our tradition of being a republic and not going out looking for monsters to slay,
right,
and the empire, take it at home. And there is something there at the heart of America that we can hopefully fan the flames and grow that movement. I mean, I don't like to get political. I mean, both parties that we were just talking about between Pepsi and Coke, but there does feel to be something. There's at least something different about Trump. It's hard to trust him, hard to know exactly where he stands, but there is a bit of that America First movement, right, in the Trump camp. I know he's a fervent Zionist, and I know he's just saying, I'm going to put 100% tariffs on anybody who doesn't want to use the U.S. dollar. So who knows? He could go terribly wrong the other way. But there are
He's claimed
elements of it.
Right. I mean, just an example, he claimed that he threatened to bomb Moscow, and then, it's the kind of, who knows? But but occasionally he does say things that reflect, he does say things that are anti-globalist. And that's one of the reasons why there's just this hysteria within the elite against him. I think actually I think a lot of the elite have realized that he's actually not a threat to them. And so he's getting a lot of money this time. The first time around, he was vastly outspent by the Democrats, because the establishment as a whole saw this guy as a terrible threat because he was making these anti-globalist statements. And I think, those are real thoughts in his head. He's not just pretending, but he just has no consistency. When he gets in power, somebody says, oh, no, you need to do this. He's, oh, yeah, okay, I'll do that or whatever. Then he tweets something else out. But anyway, let's not talk about Trump's personality. But yeah, I mean, that's even now, I think that's part of his appeal is that he sometimes does express this anti-globalist message. It's just that I don't think there's any reality behind it. I mean, it's not that, I don't think he's just putting on a show, but the guy is just incapable of really carrying through on it.
Right. Well, that's pretty depressing then. So what did we do as...
Yeah, like I say, I'm very pessimistic. I'm very pessimistic about, let's say, the short-term or medium-term future of America, because I just don't see an intelligent, coherent opposition. In Europe, you can actually point to certain parties that, that do articulate that. Most of them are on the so-called right. I mean, I think they would be called leftists, a few decades ago, but they're now called far right, which is just absurd. Some of them are considered leftists, like in Slovakia, or we had the Left Party in Germany. But they are, and one of the things I like about like the Left Party in Germany, unlike a lot of the right-wing populist parties in Europe, is that it's not only opposed to support for Ukraine, it's also strongly opposed to support for Israel. You tend to get, Zionism has quite a bit of influence. I don't even know if it's really Zionism or it's just a fear on the part of a lot of the right. And I've heard this about, for example, the off day in Germany. There's I forget the man's name again. He has his own YouTube channel. It's an Armenian from Syria who's living in Germany. But he's actually talked to a lot of the AfD. And he finds, they're completely on the same page when it comes to Ukraine. And he says, well, what about Israel? And it's not like most of them are, I don't think they respond like American politicians, like, what are you talking about, our holy ally Israel? It's just like, we just don't want to deal with that. I think it's because they're so afraid of being associated with the Nazis, that they just, they just have an official policy of we support Israel to try to protect them from that. They still get called Nazis, but I think that's what you find in Germany and in France and some other Western European countries. It's not a real, grassroots-based devotion to Israel, which you do find in this country, but it's just a kind of a strategy, an electoral strategy to protect themselves from, charges of truly being far right.
Interesting. Well, just going back to the U.S. really quick. So do you think that it's possible then for us to go back to being kind of a republic in that form of government? Or do you think that it just, when you're looking at our current political system and our presidential candidates, the election's in 2 weeks, do you think it makes any difference? And if it doesn't, does that just mean that we're just going to wait for a full collapse of the government and then try to build a republic out of the ashes?
Yeah. I'll have to say that I almost forgot that there's going to be an election in 2 weeks. I have never been so uninterested in an election. I think the candidates on both sides are just complete non-entities. And it just, the whole thing is so absurd and so undignified. Occasionally I take a peek at it and I just shake my head. It's just some sort of freak show. We're
the head of the free world. This is the light on top of the hill that we're supposed to be shining the rest of the world.
I know.
Trump and Kamala Harris.
Right. But who knows what I just can't point to anything, that we could build on right now. Just some ideas out there, a few individuals, but that's just not enough to make a movement. Again, like I said, things can change more rapidly sometimes than you can imagine. And so maybe there will be some sort of breakthrough moment in the near future, but right now I just don't see it. I don't really have any hope for the U.S. So, a collapse probably would be good because that would be a chance to rebuild. The worst thing would just be sort of a long, slow death, which is maybe what we're witnessing. But
Right. And the death comes as the government becomes more and more authoritarian. We'll see further crackdowns on speech, more attempt to control the narrative, and just control in general. And then that's kind of what slowly leads to that breakdown. It gets to a point, but it's just like, how dark will it get and for how long before we have some real change? Because it just seems like that's kind of the path that we're going, that we're just going deeper down into the cave instead of turning around and going back out and towards the light. And it sounds like you don't believe that we have any political willpower in our elite to turn around, even with the Trump or the American First movement. It doesn't sound like for you believe that there's a solution there.
I'll be honest. I wish I was somewhat hopeful about some of the comments he made back in 2016, and then he just didn't carry through on any of it. And actually, many cases, the opposite happened. You still hear this, like Trump is going to take apart NATO or is going to withdraw the U.S. from NATO. He made some comments which are true. They say, well, NATO has outlived its usefulness. Why do we have NATO anymore? He said that back in 2016. But under his administration, NATO expanded. And, NATO budgets increased. So the opposite happened. He talked about making peace with Russia, but in sanctions intensified. Ukraine was armed before. Obama had tried to hold off on that, but he lifted the restrictions. Trump did. So I think in the end you have to look at what he did rather than what he says.
Okay, well, keep your expectations low, and then you won't be disappointed, right?
Okay.
So,
well, I think it's just being realistic. It's just it's important to be realistic.
I guess sometimes I hope that there'll be some type of change as I hear things about Elon Musk could become the Department of Efficiency and just slash 90% of the government, and then we could go save a lot of money and turn things around. And the only thing I guess with Trump, I know he's bombastic and it's hard to know where his head is, but he at least will seem to be willing to talk to adversaries. So I imagine if he could talk to Pezeshkian, I think that would be a very encouraging sign if he could talk to Putin, talk to Xi Jinping, and
Well,
then it's like,
I'm
okay, we
only
can
going to
calm
be
things down. But
hopeful if he's elected and he doesn't appoint the same old swamp creatures into the foreign policy and military establishment. I mean, if he appoints some real dissidents, then I will be excited. But I'm just not holding my breath.
okay, all right. Well, is there anything else that you'd like to talk about before we sign off today?
I think no. I think that's enough. I think that was good.
Okay, all right. We'll end it there. All right. Thanks a lot, Dad.